So in this video, we're going to be talking about using Adobe Camera Raw, ACR, to merge together images into HDR images and panoramic images. We're going to start by talking about merging panoramic images together. So the example I have here is a scene of Plonk on Main Street from the back alley. And before we go into Adobe Camera Raw, I want to talk a little bit about how panoramic images should be taken, kind of some rules of thumb for making sure that they can be merged together well. So essentially what I've done here is I've started by thinking about the scene that I want to photograph. And in this case, I wanted to photograph a vertical scene of the kind of the structure of Plonk from the alley. And this is the top of the photo of the scene that I want to photograph, and this is the bottom. And you can see that this is a pretty tall scene, and it wouldn't fit in the normal dimensions of a camera frame. So that's why I've chosen to use a panoramic image here. So to take those images, essentially what I've done is, again, I've started at the bottom of the scene here, and I've taken that photo. Next, I tilted the camera up slightly, took that photo. Again, took the photo. Tilted again, took the photo, and so on until I've gotten to the top of my scene. And the other thing you'll notice is that as I was taking these photos, I overlapped each of the images by about 30%, a little more than 30% actually. And that's important to do because when you're overlapping the images, that gives the Adobe Camera Raw software kind of a reference point to link all of the images together. So once you've taken those images and figured out which ones you want to merge into the panoramic photo, you're going to select all of them. And I'm in Adobe Bridge here. Select all of them, and you're going to open in Camera Raw. Then they're all going to show up in Camera Raw and Photoshop. Again, you'll select all of them together, Control click or right click, and merge to panorama. And you're seeing here that it's asking me if I want to use the HDR panorama function instead. I'm going to click no, because if I were to use that function, that would mean that I had bracketed each of the images for this panoramic, and I didn't do that. And we'll talk about what bracketing means later on in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and click no here. And then you're going to see that it opens up a projection of what the panoramic is going to look like. The first thing you're going to see in this preview box on the right-hand side is what type of projection is being used to make the panoramic image. And what the projection mode is referring to is what surface Adobe Camera Raw is mapping all of these images onto to make the panoramic. So for the spherical projection, which is what's selected here, you can kind of see in the projection that ACR mapped these images as if they were on the inside of a surface of a sphere. So we're kind of going around the surface of a sphere here. For the cylindrical projection, ACR is going to map the images as if they were on the inside of a cylinder. And as you just saw a minute ago, it gave me an error message for that. And that's because Adobe Camera Raw wasn't able to use that projection mode with the images that I have selected. The perspective mode is going to be mapping the images as if they were on a flat surface. So each of these different projection modes have a few different strengths of their own. Ultimately, which one you decide to use depends on what your preference is, how the final image looks when it's previewed. Spherical projection mode is pretty useful for when you have really wide panoramic images or even multi-row panoramic images. Cylinder mode is also really good for wide panoramic images. And one strength of cylindrical projections is that it keeps straight lines straight. And then perspective projection is really useful also for keeping straight lines straight. And particularly perspective projection is useful for architectural photographs because it maintains relative distance between lines and reduces the amount of distortion that might be present in those scenes. So again, it kind of depends on what your preference is, what each of the projections looks like with the images that you selected. So once you've decided which projection you want to use, the next function that you'll see here is boundary warp. And essentially what boundary warp is doing is you'll see that after we've created this projection, there's some missing information on the sides. And that's to a certain extent inevitable with panoramic images because you're always going to have, as you're tilting up, there's going to be parts of the edges of the image that aren't captured, aren't overlapping. So you'll lose that part of the image. So what the boundary warp function does here is essentially it's taking the information that you do have and it's stretching it to the edges of the frame. So if we go to all the way to 100 here on boundary warp, now we don't have any of that missing information anymore. But what you can see is that after I've done that, we do have a little bit of distortion and the pipe here, a little bit of a bend in the roof, maybe a little bit of bend in this part of the building as well. So you can see that as it's stretching that information, it's also creating a little bit of distortion. And it's important to recognize that distortion is, again, pretty much inevitable with panoramic photos, because if you're taking a panoramic photo where you're tilting the camera up or tilting the camera to the side, you're changing the angle that the scene is being viewed at, and that's what creates that distortion. So what I'm going to do here is adjust the boundary warp until that pipe and that roof are a little bit less warped. I'm pretty satisfied with that. And once you've decided that you're okay with that, then you'll just click auto crop, and that will make it so that that missing information isn't showing up in the final image. So then what you're going to do after you're satisfied with the projection mode that looks the best, and after you're satisfied with the settings you've chosen for boundary warp, then you're going to go ahead and click merge. And then it's going to bring up a saving screen, and you'll go ahead and name the file whatever you want, and it's going to save that file into the same folder that you merged the images from. And obviously, if you want to change the location that it saves to, you can do that. Then you're going to go ahead and click save, and then it's going to open up the panoramic image in Adobe Camera Raw. So once you've opened your panoramic image in Adobe Camera Raw and all of the files have been merged, you have the exact same functions available to you that you would for editing any other kind of image. So I can go in, edit exposure, contrast, detail, all of those things. So for this image, I'm going to go ahead and increase the contrast a little bit. Increase clarity here. So as I'm making these edits, one thing I'm noticing is that the sky on top of the image is really blown out. It's just kind of white. So this is kind of a common occurrence in panoramic images, because if you're taking a photo of a landscape, for example, then a lot of that landscape is going to have sky in it. And sky is easy to blow out when you're trying to maintain detail in the rest of the landscape. So one tool that's really useful for fixing this kind of thing is under the graduated filter section. So if I want to darken the sky, I go ahead and set up a graduated filter. Okay. And then the problem is, though, is if I go in here and I darken the exposure, as you can see when I created the filter and even as I'm adjusting here, it's kind of adjusting the exposure for all of the parts that are in that graduated filter, including the roof. And I don't really want that. I kind of just want to darken the sky. So one tool that's really useful for addressing that is the range mask tool. And what the range mask tool does is it's telling Adobe Camera Raw to differentiate between parts of the image within the filter range that you want to make adjustments to and those that you don't want to make adjustments to. So one way to do this is with a luminance range mask. And go ahead and click visualize the range mask. And the red area in the mask is going to tell you where the adjustments are going to be applied. So you can see here that the luminance mask is going to apply adjustments in areas of the image where there's a high luminance. I'm going to go ahead and adjust this slider so that that red mask area is only showing up in the sky and not in the roof. So it's going to be mostly higher luminance values. So once I'm satisfied with that, and then again, you can see that that red mask area is applied more to the sky. And then once you get to the roof here, there's no mask. So once you've set that up, then you can go all the way back up here. I wanted to use the exposure slider, and I could drag that down to darken the sky. You can see now that instead of being blown out, there's a little bit of that blue hue. And that's what I wanted. Okay, so after you are satisfied with those adjustments, again, you have the same tools available to you to edit this panoramic to your liking, just as you would with any other photo. But yeah, definitely pay attention to that graduated filter. It's a really useful tool for adjusting the skies in a panoramic. And then of course, when you're satisfied with the image that you've created, then you go ahead and click done or open into Photoshop, depending on what editing workflow you want to use. And it will save the image to the same folder that you took the images that you merged together from. So next we're going to talk about using ACR to merge images together into an HDR photograph, or high dynamic range. And what an HDR photograph is useful for is capturing more detail in a scene where there may be really light tones and really dark tones. So in one exposure of that scene, you may lose detail in one or the other. For example, I have this scene right here. This is the normal exposure. And you can see that while the detail is defined in the lighter parts of the image, we have this region of shadow right here where there's not a lot of detail. And I want there to be detail in that part of the image. So what I would do here is I would make bracketed exposures, which is what I mentioned earlier in the video. And what that means is essentially I would take this normal exposure here, and then I would decrease the exposure by 1 or 2 stops to make sure that I'm getting all of the detail in the light tones or the highlights. And then I would go back to the normal exposure and increase that exposure by 1 or 2 stops to make sure that I was getting all of the detail in the shadow areas. So you can see that between these 3 images, I have all of the detail that I want in the scene. So now it's just a matter of combining them using Adobe Camera Raw to make sure that all of that info is in one photo. So again, I would open those in Camera Raw, select all of them, merge to HDR. And you can see here in this preview that now not only do I have detail in this part of the image where the light tones of the image are, I also have detail in the shadows. The significant function over here that we have is the deghost function. And that doesn't really apply to this image, but essentially what that means is that when you're taking an HDR image, you may have certain elements of the image that move between frames. So for example, you take your normal exposure and maybe there's a flag in the scene and the wind is blowing. So you take your normal exposure and that flag is in one position. And then as you're bracketing, maybe you take your over and under exposure and then that flag would be in different positions. So then in those 3 different bracketed photos that you're using to create the HDR, you have one element that's moved between the 3. And so you would then use the deghosting effect to get rid of that movement and make sure that there's no blur in the HDR image. But again, we don't really have any elements here. They're moving, so we don't have to worry about that. Once the images have been merged and you're satisfied with the preview, you click merge. And then similar to the panoramic photo, it will pull up a saving screen. And you can name the file to your liking, click save. Once we've merged that HDR image together, then you have all of the same functions available to you in Adobe Camera Raw that you would to edit any other image. So then I could continue to edit the shadows if I wanted to, or edit the overall exposure, edit the highlights if I wanted those to be a little bit brighter. And again, noise reduction is particularly useful with both panoramic images and HDR images, because when you're combining images together, you have a greater potential for noise to occur. So always good to add a little bit of noise reduction there. And once you're satisfied with your image, then again, you would go ahead and click done or open, depending on how you want to edit the image. And there you have your HDR image. So thank you for listening to my video. I hope that was helpful in terms of showing you how to use those functions in Adobe Camera Raw. I really appreciate being able to understand how to use those now, because I think that opens up some new ideas and some new directions for photographing different scenes. Thanks.